Well, it's great to be here at the Strand. I feel like I'm beginning a concert or something, but it's been a pleasure for me to get to know Annabelle over the years. I was a curator at the Clark Art Institute before I went to the Menil, and was very lucky to see the project that Annabelle worked on there, which was this beautiful project to restore both the 1955 and 1973 buildings there. It's really stunning, and if you haven't been there, I really recommend you going to it. And it's fantastic to sit next to Michael, who I met just for the first time this evening, but whose work I followed. If you work at a museum and know how crazy it is to try to understand how to get people from one place to another, you look to Michael's work all the time to try to crib some notes about what to do. So it's great to be here with both of you. So I thought that what we might start with is to get some understanding of the book, the layout of the book, and then we can probe into the very hard ontological questions of the design of the book. But first you'll see the cover of the book, and please, and this is just kind of an open thing, so and then I wanted to ask you, there's this obviously very purposeful decision to have this portfolio section and project section. And I wondered how that came about, how the idea of working with Todd Eberle to do the photography section came about, and then, I'm adding too much to this question already, but how the sequencing became something that you were working through and working together with, or working against each other to figure out the way into.
You want to start with Todd?
Well, can you hear me? To begin with, Todd Eberle is an old friend. I've always thought that he was a marvelous architectural photographer. He is truly an artist. But for me, looking at the architectural photography that he's done over the years was always what I almost liked best in his work, because he has a particular eye. And being that he is a friend, truly a friend for more than 20 years, I have talked to him for probably 20 years about doing a book. And he always said, yes, yes, yes. And then I realized very quickly that there was no way in hell that I would be able to get such a busy, successful photographer to work just on my book. Anyway, as it were, 15 years ago or so, the first time when we talked about a book, I said what I would really like is if there was just a section of only your photographs, because it would relieve me from having to say anything about the work, and you could just look at it. And looking at it the way you would, that really seemed great. Anyway, time goes by, and the opportunity arose again, and so we went back to this very old idea, and when I was lucky enough to convince Michael of helping us with the book, I think that was one of the first things that I talked about, that this idea of the portfolio and the project section.
So here's another example. There are these spreads where there's just one image of one particular building, but others where there are these juxtaposition of kind of Todd's great insight into very particular places. I know the left very well. And then it's the most gorgeous bathroom you could ever imagine at the Clark Art Institute. And then this kitchen at an Upper West Side apartment. So how do these, I mean, there's one thing to have Todd take these great photographs. There's another way that you can choose to sequence them so it almost looks like a Karl Blossfeldt book, where you kind of pick up these formal patterns. So I wonder how that came about.
When we first talked with Annabelle about the book, I think we had exactly the same response. It was actually really, these kinds of projects can be very difficult, but this was very, very simple. And I hope that when you look at the book, the ease, that there's a kind of ease when you look at the book. It doesn't look like it's certainly not meant to feel overwrought or labored over. And I don't think it is. It feels very kind of like easy. And one of the things that made it easy was that when Annabelle made the decision to hire, to convince Todd and collaborate with him to take all these photographs. We knew that, my theory was that the photographs would each photograph would both kind of be a way of describing one of Annabelle's buildings or spaces, but also would be a photograph that could stand on its own with its own merit. And then you sort of, then the sequencing, in fact, you could have sequenced it in an entirely different way. You could have segregated each of the building types. Here's all the cultural buildings, here's all the residences, here's all the whatevers, and in fact, in this very building, I promise you, any one of you could find 20 books organized precisely like that, some of which I actually designed, so I could find them probably faster than anyone. But by having the photographs have their own logic, just as if you find on these shelves in the rare book room, you find the first edition of The Americans by Robert Frank or something. That isn't like, they're not segregated by city or by thing. It's just it's the juxtapositions between this image and that image that makes you look harder at them and see different things. And I think one of the challenges, one of the invitations that we sort of had with Annabelle was to show that a bathroom in a museum could be juxtaposed with a commercial space, could be juxtaposed with a residence, could be juxtaposed with an industrial space, and they were all just different design responses to different situations, but they were all, it was a way, in fact, that I think we used, unbeknownst to Annabelle, our own private thing was sort of using this as an experiment to sort of see whether we could kind of isolate that Selldorf sensibility that I know you're so sometimes in denial about, and sort of trying to say doesn't really exist intentionally. But I think it's always there, and I think in doing it this way, the book sort of, it emerges for every reader, everyone looking at the pictures in their own way.
Yeah, I think that's true. And for me, the great satisfaction was that working with two people as great as Michael and Todd, that what emerged is really that sort of interesting coming together of a rational way of thinking about things paired with an intuitive response. And then the third thing about it was really the sort of collaborative time of all of us sitting around the table. I will say that this was one of my favorite times last year, the meetings that we had together where we would all be together, and it wasn't just Michael and Todd, but it was everybody from Faden and from Michael's office, and sometimes we left Todd out of the picture. Okay, only sometimes. He did come. But it was fun.
And in fact, I mean, to my surprise, Todd actually could advocate pretty strongly for almost a much more conventional descriptive photo essay on each of the projects, right? And I think it's sort of the conversations actually demonstrated that there were so many different ways of combining those images in the beginning. It ended up being an interesting challenge to figure it out. You would take one picture, a new picture would arrive. You'd sort of realize that its logical place would be the visual logic would dictate here, but that would kind of throw some other things off. Working in our office with Julia Lemley, who's here, and Jessica Svensson, who was the designer in charge of the project, we just went back and forth and sifted it over and over again. And there was just so many different sort of possibilities, ways to combine them.
Yeah, in a way, it was actually humorous at times because I feel fairly seriously about my work, but putting it in this context allowed for a lightness that I think all of us really wanted.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of architectural monographs, I don't know if you guys are fans or students of that genre, but a lot of times they have a little bit of this labored sense of a forced march. You can sort of tell that at some point early on, someone made a list of all the projects that will go in the book. And now someone will accumulate the images that represent each one of those projects and then write a description of...
Kierkegaard. That's all I can say. Michael prevented us from putting the Kierkegaard quotes underneath.
But it can just have this. It's not just that it's not just that it's pretentious. It's not just that it could be boring to read, but it also just looks like work. It looks like you can sort of see the sweat all over it. It just was hard work and no fun to do. Whereas I think part of one of the characteristics of if I would say so myself, one of the characteristics of Annabelle's work and the spaces you go in that she's designed is that they've managed to combine this seriousness, the serious attention to what their intended function is, with this sort of sense of joy and surprise, and that's like really rare. And the essayists in the book, kind of one way or another, each of them remark on that sooner or later. And I think that's we wanted the book to sort of have that same sense, I'd say.
I was struck by kind of a complimentary thing that you were talking about, Michael, that in some monographs you have this arch seriousness, but I've seen a number lately that have this almost forced preciousness, or even trying to make too light of the projects embarked upon. And what I kind of really found valuable was the balance struck. And there's almost kind of this kind of sense of wanting to have in play the rational, kind of the idea that this program was developed to do something. But there was also the kind of phenomenological playfulness that you have when you open this book and you see the Clark bathroom. But then you have something like the seriousness of, Richard Serra's great piece that was installed at the Davis Werner Gallery on 20th Street. So I wonder how, we've talked about it a little bit, but in your own work, even looking at this book, there seems to be this duality. I know nothing's as easy as duality, but when thinking about this book, was there a purposefulness? And some of this probably doesn't make sense until you see that then there is, these beautiful series of photographs, but then you have the projects, which follow a very descriptive text to talk about the reason for the project and what it's supposed to fulfill, and then very useful photographs to give different vantage points on it. So why the duality? You could have brought in 3 different photographers, because I know you're friends with many different ones, but there was one, and then there was the project. And was this something that, you said you arrived on quickly, but what might have been the other ideas that were thrown out, that kind of left on the drafting room table?
Well, I think in my life, I use books as functional objects. I use books to sort of inspire myself to look up things that I've seen before, and I may or may not read the entire text, but they become a visual stimulus as much as they become a source of information. And that information is intensely useful when it's well handled. I know exactly where that book is, where I have seen this, and I pretty much can go to the page that it's at. And so, to some extent, I felt, or I still feel, that we wanted to provide that. And the rest is the rest, because you always want the sort of sumptuous, sort of pleasurable moment of being able to say, wow, that's a really interesting take, that's great. And I have a little bit of distance to the pictures that Todd took, because I really do believe that there is a sort of artistic individual take on that. They don't claim to be all of it. They're his point of view. And so I think Michael and I agreed very early on that was an interesting way to do it, to sort of really say, this is about one person's point of view.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I remember coming away from the very first meeting and saying to Jessica and Julia, we were talking, we said, well, there's actually 3 different elements in the book. There are the color plates, the portfolio section, there's the projects, but then there are essays and interviews and text matter in between. And sometimes when you're doing this work, and I find as a graphic designer, I'm always pressured to do this, if you propose that you'll have page after page just of text, people panic and say, well, that's boring, how will, people won't be able to handle that, yet, there are a bunch of Nabokov books over there that, as I recall, I don't think Pale Fire
pictures.
and, is filled with pictures to distract you when you get bored with reading whatever he's writing about, so I think, if it's worth reading, you should just kind of have confidence in the text. Likewise, if the pictures are good, you should have confidence that the pictures will draw you in. And I think, and so we actually, I remember we went back and we said, okay, you have A, B, and C, and you could do A, B, A, C, A, or you could do, so we ended up deciding, as opposing, you had these 3 ingredients on the kitchen countertop. You could dice them all really fine and make a stew out of them, or you could compose a plate and kind of let the flavor of each of them speak for itself.
Yeah.
Which I think has a lot to do with how elegant and how beautiful the design turned out. Because, needless to say, I think that the texts are great. But for Michael to give us this confidence and the beautiful way they were organized and set in a sort of rhythm within the book is something that I realize is like, yeah, that's a very strong concept.
I'm going to ask a very plebeian one, but I know that when I looked at the book, I was struck by, and wasn't surprised by, the fact that there was a very particular kind of cover, a very particular color, no flyleaf, and the idea to do it this way, that has the name, the project, and this blue, which is very striking, but it wasn't grounded or bounded by one particular project. I wonder, was that, like these other decisions, something that you came to quickly, or was this part of the collaboration?
So Michael alluded to some books that have been published lately that, like everybody else, you're sort of drawn to how beautiful they are, how serious they are, and how great. And for one reason or another, I've always been fascinated with book linen. I've always loved that material, and sort of the fact that it has something to do with making of books. There's something very satisfying about that, and I really wanted that texture. But I was sick and tired of those freaking tasteful books. And everybody would expect us to come up with something like very sober and very proper and blah, blah, blah. And so I think we just basically, the first time we talked about it, we agreed we're not going to do that. And if I recall, we came down to 2 colors. And that was it. It was canary yellow and or this beautiful blue. And so then we took a majority vote, and I won.
Yeah, and I think the blue, there's again, there's the trap that a book designer could fall into is very similar to the kind of the challenge that you face when you do a gallery or a museum. At least when you do that work, this isn't true for everyone that practices your profession, but I think when you do it, you're always very conscious of creating the best possible atmosphere, the best possible setting for the art that's going to be shown there, whether it's the Neue Gallery or Swirm or whatever it is, right? And they're very different places. The Clark, very different from an urban gallery, let's say. They're very different experiences. But I think paramount is that people go there not not primarily to admire the architecture, but because they're drawn by the art that they want to see inside. And I think in some cases that is an invitation to kind of abdicate, your role. They could seem an invitation to abdicate your role as an architect and just say, look, I'm providing a clean, well-lit space, and nothing to see here, folks. Just keep moving. And I think yet that is not true. I think that every one of those spaces that I named, and every such space in the book that's photographed, that's represented, people would recognize that it's both at once a really beautiful setting for the art that's shown, but it has a kind of presence in and of itself, right? Yeah. And if there's a balance is struck. And I think by the same token, you design a book for someone who is a visual artist or a designer or an architect. Your responsibility is to create a frame for that work and to not add to the noise or not distract from the subject matter that's being shown. Yet you want to, you don't want to create this arid sort of, sense of sensory deprivation, which, and then I think a little bit of joy comes back in when you have something like the blue color on the book, and it's like, it's just a color, it's just blue, and there's some lettering on the front. It's like not like the cover of the year or anything, but I think it actually,
We did have that cover where I was wearing that bathing suit, then we just took that away.
But I do think, it's
decided not to print it.
I think every book has needs a welcome mat and a doorknob. You sort of have to feel you're invited to come in. You have to understand how you're going to move around in this space. And I think that we came up with some devices that created both those things.
Well, I think both of you have been talking about it, but everyone in this room, I think, is thrilled that this book exists. But I wonder if you peel back a little bit to hear some of the conversations that you might have had about, what is a monograph for an architect to do now that's different than, say, 25 years ago, and kind of lessons that maybe both of you have learned from being one who uses monographs when thinking about her work, or Michael, when you're making books like this, what are the lessons learned? What did you not want to repeat? What did you want to repeat that kind of the tangible physical thing, the objectness of the thing can do that something online, for example, can't do? So I kind of wonder the backstory, the kind of the thinking behind before the making.
Well, one of the things that I think anyone involved in this sort of thing is always conscious of, and I think it's true for someone like Annabelle, who's the architect whose work is being represented. It's also true for any architectural photographer, and certainly anyone who does what we do, is that we're not writing a novel about some imaginary world. We're actually representing real places. And I haven't. Todd and Annabelle have been in all those places. But I've barely been probably in a third of them, maybe not even that many. And one of the functions that a book has is it's meant to actually let people understand work like that, even if they're not fated to see it with their own eyes, even if they'll never see it with their own eyes. And it's actually it's a challenge and it's a responsibility to do that. And again, sort of this promise of neutrality, and this dream of neutrality you sort of see as it's unachievable. And again, there's a whole history of, you just look at photography alone, the way that, Ezra Stoller really defined, mid-century corporate modernism as practiced by Skidmore, and on and on. You sort of see that these things aren't just kind of like put the camera on a tripod and open the shutter and then the truth floods in, and nor is it happen when that thing turns into ink on paper and it ends up on someone's shelf. It's really a series of conscious decisions we made to represent a body of work. And And I think in this case, part of it was, I mean, I just really, I think I remember coming away from that first meeting saying, I just think it'd be so great if you just turned the page and you went right from the Neue Gallery to the Sunset Park, industrial facility, and just sort of realize these are two expressions of what design can be, what architecture can be, and what a single architect and her sensibility can create, And so I think part of it was, what's weird, I think, is that when we were talking about it, I don't think I ever revealed this to Annabelle, but I was sort of like really getting all jazzed about kind of like, the jarring character of the juxtapositions. I just thought it would be just getting I thought it would be almost like, like atonal music where it'd be like banging sounds, then strings come in for 4 seconds, and suddenly there's a cat meowing, Instead, God damn it, like you go through the book and it has this sort of like flow that just seems perfectly natural. So, and that's because the commonality isn't the margins that we determined, or I would say it's not even the photographer's sensibility. It's the fact that Annabelle, in her mind, somehow that fights its way through and comes through on every page somehow.
Yeah, I love hearing you describe that, because for me, of course, it's truly the opposite. I look at a picture and I have no idea what somebody else sees, because I see the whole thing. I remember how unbelievably difficult it was to convince a structural engineer to make the stair stringer 4 inches deep and not 6 inches deep, and then that's a whole story unto itself, and they cost more money, and it took more time. And I think, it looks okay, it's fine. But there's always that but. I mean, I'm German after all. And what I see and experience is very, very different, I think, from what somebody else will see. And needless to say, I have an opinion about everything, but not the distance. And so the pictures, the photos, the story that I respond to, that's really the best I can do, is I can have some kind of a response. And so it needs somebody who is as clear-eyed as Michael to bring that fresh vision to it.
David, I have a question. Can I ask Annabelle something? I'm sorry to usurp your role as interrogator.
Please.
Does it unnerve you at all, or I mean, let me just ask you, what do you make of the idea that once a book like this is out there, many of these buildings, much of your work, there's a kind of reductiveness to it. It becomes that image, that famous image of that particular project, and particularly the work that's slightly less accessible, that's not intended to be public projects. But some of those images just become the ones that are fated to represent the way people think of that project, and hence your work.
No, I don't worry about that one little bit, because I think architecture has to be seen in the flesh. No piece of architecture, however great the photographs of it are, can ever be as great as it is in real life if it's truly a piece of architecture. For example, many of you will have seen endless photographs of Salk Institute in La Jolla, and I love the work of Louis Kahn, have looked at it over and again, and the day when I had the opportunity to go visit it in real life, it was a heavenly day. It was a really amazing experience, because it was so much more. It was so much more intelligent. It was so much more overwhelming. So one has a little bit of hope that it makes people curious to go see a space because of that image, and you hope that image just does a little bit of it. And I think this is a really huge thing to discuss, because everybody sees everything on their iPhone, on their computer, via the internet. People are so much less curious to actually go and travel to places to really experience them. architecture is an experiential art. You can't get it if you're not there. You don't understand scale, light, space, the intelligence of structure, the collaborative effort between the mechanical engineer and the structural engineer with the architect, in the case of Salk Institute, unless you're there. And that's such an incredibly enriching experience that, if anything, you hope that you make people a little bit more curious to go and see things and see places. Like, I remember going to India and seeing Chandigarh, and I had seen endless books. My Corbusier library is rather complete. And then there I was, I found myself in Chandigarh, and the smells, the noises, the people, the animals, the air, everything was incredibly overwhelming, and it was so different from the pictures that were maybe perfect or better than perfect. And of course, I took many, many pictures myself, and those were the days when people had to actually get paper developed on film. I came back and I developed these photos, and the photos looked exactly the same as the pictures in the books. And it was so funny because I thought, wait a minute, that's not what I photographed. Only to say that real life is more interesting and better than a reproduction can be, no matter how great the photography is.
I also had kind of a modern music moment when looking through the book. It's a little bit different, but it gets to the idea of kind of the publicness of the projects that you're talking about. And I was thinking about this great anecdote that Morton Feldman told of playing a piece of characteristically difficult music to a friend. And his friend says, well, what do you think about the everyman who's going to listen to this? And just at that moment, Feldman says he looks out the window and Jackson Pollock walks by. And he said, that's my everyman then from now on. So, I mean, it's interesting that you, and I think that there's kind of a rigor to your work, to both of your work, and to think about what these, who your publics are and what you expect from them and what you ask of them is very compelling. But even in this instance that you're talking about, the idea of people going to something, there is an invitation for people to see. It's not just the client involved. There's a generosity to this. I think that was kind of interesting about the spreads too, that the bathroom is next to the lovely, important gallery that has the important Richard Serra sculpture in it. So I wonder how you kind of work through these ideas when you, obviously you're doing the project, but then when you're kind of memorializing them then in this context.
Well, when you're in architecture school, you learn about all the great moments in architecture, and if you're lucky, you get to visit some of them, and that experience transports you to a place that makes you think that there is a real contribution that architecture brings to life. It's the transformative power of architecture is something that architects think about a lot. All of that is a little bit in the back of one's mind when you are trying to detail that staircase that I was talking about, or the bathroom. But every once in a while you get to experience how other people find space, and maybe the most powerful one for me was after we finished the Neue Galerie. I had always thought nobody really cares about, how fine like the plaster moldings are restored, and I was like obsessing over it, and it was painful too at times. And when the museum was finally open, the art looked wonderful, and the general space was festive, and it was a great deal of celebration, and I was really glad that it was all behind me. But there I was walking around the building behind some people who'd come to visit, and I overheard them talk about how much they enjoyed the space, how well they understood the fact that it was a house that had been transformed into a museum, and they talked to one another, and they were ordinary people. They talked to one another about some details that I thought nobody in their right mind will ever think about this other than myself. And I can't begin to tell you how much that meant to me, because I realized, of course, everybody is the same. We cherish the great moments. We cherish civilization. We want to come together in places that are welcoming, that want us to be there. And ultimately, it is, I think, what our work is all about. It's about people bringing the architecture to life. And that's why you do it. So it's great when that happens.
But what's amazing is that that's not typical. Or it's surprising how I wouldn't say it's in. When you were talking before, David, I was thinking that Annabelle's architecture is very rigorous, but I don't think it's difficult in a way. It's not meant to sort of be hard for people to understand, or hard for them, or challenge or confound their expectations in a way that kind of makes them kind of contemplate, their own alienation from reality in the 21st century. It's just they can take in the things on their own terms, and I think they're just they can enjoy them sometimes, and sometimes very consciously, as I think in the case of the Neue Gallery, where you're clearly in a beautiful house that's been open to you. Then other places you just you don't perceive it necessarily as a deliberately designed space, or you're conscious of something else, but yet you're subconsciously, you kind of like take in the spatial arrangement, the way the light is playing, the way materials are juxtaposed, and the same thing comes through.
I think in a weird way sometimes this may sound a little self-aggrandizing. It takes a great deal of confidence to do something that doesn't require applause at every minute, but that is about a kind of bigger thing. And I remember years ago reading an interview with Rem Koolhaas, who talked about wanting to make sure that the brutality of everyday life was present in the work. And I kept thinking about that. I'm not sure that he would still say that. I'm not sure that he meant it necessarily. But I thought, that's really not what I'm interested in. I think brutality can stand very well on its own 2 feet. I don't need to help it. But to sort of step back and say, your job is to bring people together, to create. I was in an architecture school the other day, and there was this young student who said, if I can just contribute and bring a little bit of beauty into this world, I think that's what I would like to do. And I thought, that's pretty awesome. Sign me on.
Well, I think the fight against brutality might be a good time to bring the audience in to see if they have any questions.
Hello. You talked about the color of the book, the yellow versus the blue. Was that based in like market research, or was that based in like some narrative that went back to like a project? I mean, I'm familiar with your work, but not so much to say that I can think of one of those colors being like repeated in some way. I'm just wondering if there's narrative in the colors.
I can only speak to the extensive market research that was done, which was not at all. I think it's funny. The book is actually, among other things, we haven't commented on this sufficiently. I don't think it's wonderful to read. Like it's a lot of times these sometimes in these books the essays and the writing is just sort of like it's just padding or just put in to kind of like add a little bit of solemnity to the proceedings. In this case, they really are interesting, revealing, and thoughtful essays. And one of there's an interview that the interview with Tom. I think he asks you. He raises the idea of taste. Is that in that interview? And he says something like, there's then there's taste, and architects don't like to talk about taste, or it's seen as being this kind of like arbitrary thing that we either have to dismiss or discount. But to me, the cover, like there are all these decisions you have to make. Like the cover, you can't not have it. You can't say it's not going to be any color at all. We're going to be that neutral, right? So it has to be something. And then all of a sudden, it could be gray. And I remember that discussion well, sort of like, oh, that gray book that Annabelle Selldorf put out. There's just something about, And I remember, like Annabelle just said, she wanted to kind of create an object. I remember thinking it could be an object that if you saw it in the room as I can over your shoulder right there, all the way across the room, that sort of has a kind of presence as an object. And I think making it a color makes it, makes it stand up as a protagonist as opposed to a member of the chorus or an extra in the crowd.
Yeah, mind you, we're not the first people to ever do a blue book. It's actually funny enough. The blue book, architects used to use the blue book, it has that quality, but there's a little bit of a lightheartedness, and in some way I also wanted it to not be so like Michael said, Selldorf, gray book, right.
And it is sort of a sky blue. It's sort of, I don't know, it's like a nice background color, if nothing else.
So I have two questions about the design process. So Michael, first for you, I'm wondering if there are any particular challenges that you had to face with an architect as your client, particularly a talented architect who by her own admission has an opinion about everything. So that's on the one side. And then Annabelle, the flip side of that is, given that you do have an opinion about everything by your own admission, I wonder if you ever experienced or had to kind of hold back and kind of hold yourself back a little bit so you didn't kind of hijack the design process.
Well, I'll go first. When I started my own office or my own thing, I designed my business card, and it was gilt sands, and it was like this little rectangle that had all the letters equally spaced and adjusted on the right, and it was in the center of the card, and I thought it looked awesome. And there was a printer on Canal Street who would print these things for you for, I don't know, it was a very noteworthy small amount of money. And I loved that card. Thought it was fantastic. I did notice every now and then people looked at it and said they couldn't read it because it was in very, very small print. Mind you, I was really young then. So then, I don't know, I came across this graphic designer who looked at my card and said, "Who the hell designed that card? You really need help." And I was so offended. But being the polite person that I am, or was, I said, sure, yeah, well, if you want to think about it. And he sent me back this idea of what my card looked like, and it was just awful. So at that moment, I realized, okay, I have to find somebody who can properly design my business card. And that's what it was like with the book. It's like such incredible privilege if you can work with people who know what they're doing. Designing a book was not my expertise, and who better but Michael and his team. And it truly was a privilege, and it just made my life and our experience so much richer. I have to sort of, at this moment though, get Lisa Green, my phenomenal partner, to stand up and get a round of applause for not only spearheading it, but sort of safeguarding the process and teaching me how to not be so opinionated about everything. And I really thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Any more questions? I think we have time for one more.
Annabelle, I'm curious, in the process and the experience of making this book, did you come to any new observations about your work that you hadn't before?
No. Yeah, one does all the time. I mean, it's a really strange thing because, among other things, there's all that time that has passed since those projects were done, and there's not one that stands out. I think that over the period that the book covers, our trajectory has changed a little bit, and the projects have gotten larger, and the office has gotten larger, and I will admit that for the first time I sort of feel I'm incredibly proud that we've done all of these projects, and that we have just an amazing office with fantastic people who I love working with, and that's a huge learning process, because I was very much from the onset doing my own thing, and I was going to do it alone, and I could just, like my business card. So yeah, that's a big learning thing.
So I want to thank both of you for tonight and for the beautiful book and all of your beautiful work. And I know that there's some time left over to sign a few books if one is interested. And thanks all of you for coming.